In little more than 4 months from now, Labor will have been in power in Canberra for 5 years. What a 5 years it has been. A landslide victory that demolished the Howard era, a leadership coup, a cliffhanger poll, a hung parliament. Today, despite its triumph in dodging the bullet of the global financial crisis and a formidable record of legislative achievement, federal Labor seems trapped in a state of perpetual turmoil. This week, yet another opinion poll brought yet more dismal news for Labor. Once more, their primary vote languishing south of 30%, and a two-party preferred vote of 56-44, spelling electoral annihilation. Once more, the Prime Minister failing in the ratings game, despite voter satisfaction with Tony Abbott sinking to its worst ever level. The opposition leader still leads Julia Gillard 40% to 36% as preferred Prime Minister. As sure as night follows day in the cycle of bad poll results, the media is once more awash with leadership speculation. Tough times indeed for Labor and the straitened ranks of true believers. At the forefront of those ranks stands the trade union movement, facing more than a few issues of its own with the scandals swirling around the Health Services Union. The Australian Council of Trade Unions is the peak body of the trade union movement in Australia, representing about 2.5 million workers. While the ACTU is not affiliated with the ALP and does not contribute towards policy formulation or party funding, its voice carries great weight in the halls of Labor power. For the past 2 years, that voice, once trapped in the rough nasal drone of the Hawke, Crean and Ferguson eras, has most often been heard in the distinctly softer tones of a distinguished former nurse. Geraldine, Ged Kearney, became the third woman president of the ACTU in July 2010, excuse me, just a few days after Julia Gillard became the first woman Prime Minister of Australia. The daughter of a Richmond publican, she was the second youngest of 9 children, excuse me again, which no doubt gave her an early start in working the numbers. As her CV nicely puts it, she was brought up in a household where the importance of the collective, both in politics and society, was emphasised from an early age. After becoming a registered nurse in 1985, Ged worked in many settings across the public and private acute care sectors, and also spent time as a nursing educator, managing the clinical nursing education department at Austin Health. Her trade union career began when she became an elected official of the Australian Nursing Federation in 1997, later serving as an Assistant Federal Secretary, Federal President and Victorian Branch President of the Federation. In early 2008, she was elected Federal Secretary of the ANF. The Federation now represents more than 200,000 nurses and midwives and is one of the fastest growing, no, I think, Ged, you correct me today, the fastest growing union in the country. Throughout her career, Ged has championed the role of the trade union movement in improving the lives, working conditions and retirement benefits for working people and their families. We are delighted to have her with us today to hear her take on the big issues facing Labor and the trade union movement. Please welcome Ged Kearney.
I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, past and present, of the land on which we meet. And thank you, Mark, for that lovely, warm welcome, and to the Melbourne Press Club for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to acknowledge the role of the Melbourne Press Club, particularly the one it plays in fostering debate and discussion about important issues, leading professional development in the media, and of course the famous Quill Awards, which I'm told results in many sore heads more than anything else. But I also very much appreciate the opportunity to address you today, because it is important for the union movement to have a constructive relationship with the media. Unionists and journalists have more in common than you think. We both regularly end up at the bottom of those surveys about the least trusted professions. But I think we get a bad rap, because a democratic society cannot function without both strong unions and a free press. The media coverage of the union movement veers between painting us as a spent force, irrelevant to modern Australia, to a powerful bogeyman dragging down our productivity and international competitiveness. The work we do is often ignored, or, if it is covered, presented as something that would have happened without unions. But our work is important. What unions have built is important. This year in Victoria, we've seen hospital nurses and mental health nurses fight the state government for decent pay rises and to retain nurse-patient ratios for the crucial long-term future of our health system. At the Coles Distribution Centre, operated by Toll Group in Melbourne's northern suburbs, workers fought to be treated the same as Coles warehouse workers in other states, rather than as second-class employees. Public school teachers, principals and other staff are uniting to hold Ted Baillieu to his promise to make Victorian teachers the best paid in Australia. And with Victoria's economy on the edge of recession, building unions are campaigning to get a lazy government to invest in projects that will create jobs. We've had wins on protection for outworkers in the clothing industry and rules that stop truck drivers having to drive themselves to death. Unions representing workers at Ford in Geelong and Broadmeadows are seeking to ensure that redundancies are minimised, that workers are treated with respect and that their industry has a future. And in your own industry, the MEAA and other unions have worked hard in recent months as a bridge between management and staff in a tumultuous time for traditional media. I am proud to be the head of the largest social movement in this country, a movement with close to 2 million members. It's a movement that is changing rapidly. While the traditional industrial unions are still important and play a vital role in our movement, in recent years union membership has shifted towards more female-dominated public and community sector workers. My own former union, the Australian Nursing Federation, is the embodiment of this trend. As we heard in the introduction, it now has more than 210,000 members and is growing rapidly. All unions face the common challenges of being collective organisations in an increasingly individualistic society and of organising a workforce that is becoming mobile and temporary. We cannot be too pessimistic about these challenges, though. I think the defeatist arguments that people are no longer joiners is too simplistic. AFL clubs and even political organisations like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition or the Oak Tree Foundation prove that people, even young people, do recognise the importance of collective organisation. Unions are aware of this, and we recognise that if we find new ways to connect with people whose interests we represent, they will join us. The mistake that is often made is assuming that a decline in membership means that our values and beliefs are no longer supported by the Australian people. It also ignores the fact that the work of unions directly benefits millions of people who are not union members. At the start of this month, 1.4 million workers began receiving an extra 2.9% in their pay packets, a wage rise only possible through the ACTU's annual wage case in Fair Work Australia. The magnificent campaign for equal pay for community sector workers run by the ASU and other unions will benefit hundreds of thousands of workers, union members or not. It will also benefit millions of vulnerable Australians who rely on the community sector for help. Concepts like unfair dismissal laws, penalty rates and paid leave remain popularly important, despite the best efforts of employer groups to demonise them. More broadly, the values of fair pay, collective bargaining, safe workplaces, and the belief that workers have a right to be treated with dignity in the workplace are still embedded in the Australian DNA. These values are what make Australia unique and great. In fact, they're a beacon for migrants from all over the world. The success of the Your Rights at Work campaign should remind all politicians that the broader Australian community, not just union members, will stir and respond to unfair attacks on working conditions. But in Australia, we are not just a protest movement. We have been involved in big social changes that have shaped this nation. From the introduction of aged pensions through to the economic reforms of the 1980s and 1990s, and the introduction of compulsory super through to pricing carbon pollution. At the recent ACTU Congress, Bill Kelty gave a rousing speech in which he noted that the history of Australia is in large part the history of unions. The country was made by unionism, he said. The very spirit of the place, what you feel about it, has unionism as part of it. They're about the creation in this country of a better nation. And I couldn't agree with him more. There have always been and remain powerful vested interests with deep pockets and political influence who oppose unions and what they stand for. Much of what has been won since 2007, when Australians joined with unions to comprehensively reject work choices, is now under threat. A concerted and deeply misleading campaign by employer groups, big business, and the Liberal Party is being waged to undermine collective bargaining, unfair dismissal, and the award safety net. This tired ideological approach of some in the business community is an attempt to drag us back to the depths of work choices era. Now, if the polls stay as they are, we may well have a coalition government by the end of next year. And worse than that, it could be a coalition government which has not been honest about its plans for industrial relations. We know that big business is whispering in the coalition's ears that it must rewrite the Fair Work Act to reduce the ability of unions to represent workers and to introduce the kind of one-way flexibility that will allow the stripping of penalty rates and other hard-won conditions. What we hear coming from the coalition party room tells us work choices is far from dead, buried and cremated. Exposing Abbott's real agenda on IR will be an important role for unions between now and the next election. Yesterday, the ACTU executive met in Melbourne, and the view was unanimous that regardless of who is in government, our members expect unions to always stand up for the issues that matter to Australian workers: job security, decent pay and conditions, rights and respect at work, and safe workplaces. They want us to advocate for a better and fairer Australia. It's what we did in 2005, 2006, and 2007 during your rights at work. There is strong support for the ACTU to have a permanent, well-funded campaigning capacity. Alongside our new Secretary, Dave Oliver, I'm committed to the community-based campaigning we saw in your rights at work, because that is the way to change public policy. The mining industry, the licensed clubs, have successfully used this model to influence public opinion. We need to be a constant presence in every suburb, in every town, in every home, campaigning on the issues that matter to all working people, regardless of who is in power or the stage of the electoral cycle. Regardless of who is in government, unions must independently pursue broader progressive vision for our society and the economy and build community support for our goals. We need to plan for long-term campaigning to achieve our goals. Paid parental leave, for example, took decades of campaigning before it was introduced by this Labor government, and to make commitments of resources to see it through to the end. There is strong support from all unions for the ACTU to take a more prominent leadership role on big national campaigns that will benefit all workers. And so the executive approved a levy of $2 per member to establish a permanent campaign fund. Now, I would like to make it very clear This levy is not an extra impost on members. It is a reallocation of existing resources which recognises that workers also need to campaign at a broader level than their own workplace or industry. Work choices made people realise just what a big difference workplace laws can make to their wages, their conditions, and ultimately to their lives. We will continue to push the Gillard government to implement policies for working people, such as a big boost to funding for aged care and legislation to strengthen the GEARS entitlement scheme. We'll also tackle the broader issues that are turning Australia into a more unfair society, entrenching inequality. We're big supporters of the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. This is a landmark reform. It's on a par with the introduction of Medicare, and it's an absolute disgrace that the Conservative state governments would threaten to sabotage it for pure political gain. If there's one issue, though, that cuts across our entire workforce and is being confronted by every one of our affiliate unions, it is the issue of insecure work. In the last 25 years, employers across the economy have taken advantage of workplace changes to put people on contracts, employ workers as casuals or through labour hire. Today, about 40% of Australian workers are in insecure work, without any paid leave entitlements or guaranteed hours. Last year, the ACTU commissioned the first comprehensive national inquiry into insecure work, and it was headed by the former Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe, who's joined us today. The inquiry was a massive undertaking. It held hearings all around the country and took hundreds of submissions from workers, employers, unions and researchers. They described insecure work as soul-destroying and said they were made to feel like disposable workers. It found that the modern economy is built on shifting risk onto the shoulders of some of our most vulnerable workers and their families, such as the cleaners who find out an hour before their shift if they're needed that day. TAFE teachers on February to November contracts, and labourers forced to work as independent contractors so their employers can avoid paying superannuation or workers' comp. I'd love to buy a house and settle down, but to make that kind of commitment whilst on a contract is ridiculous, said Monika, a primary school teacher in her 20s. Colin, a labour hire worker in the offshore oil and gas industry, said, "It wears me down not being able to plan ahead." And Joel, a casual in healthcare, lamented at having no control over his work. "I simply just have to wait for a call to go to work at the last minute," he said. You know, this is not the Australia of the fair go that I grew up in. Our low unemployment rate masks the fact that a large part of the workforce is churning through a series of low-paid jobs without security, without permanency, without a chance to upgrade their skills. We're moving to a situation where our workforce is made up of a well-skilled, well-paid core and an underskilled periphery that moves from low-paid, insecure job to the next. This uncertainty about job insecurity is fueling other anxieties amongst working families. Cost of living rates are rising. They're far more frightening. Cost of living rises are far more frightening if you don't know how many hours you'll be working next week. And believe me, a 20-year mortgage seems a lot bigger when your current contract at work ends in 3 months. Or worse, for many, the dream of buying a home is completely out of reach when a bank will not lend to you because you don't have the guarantee of ongoing employment. The Howe inquiry has produced a landmark report, Lives on Hold, and a host of recommendations not only to workplace laws, but also to the welfare and training systems for how to address this issue. Everywhere I go, workers are excited that finally, someone is going to do something about insecure work. In this room today, we have a worker who had direct experience of what I'm talking about. I'm sure many others do as well. But for 2 weeks, Frank, who's sitting at a table down there, give us a wave, Frank. Frank took part in the strike for better pay and conditions at the Coles National Distribution Warehouse at Somerton. Now, this dispute has highlighted an issue that was identified by the Howe inquiry. That is the severing of the employment relationship by outsourcing the responsibility to a contract employer. Under an agreement done at the height of work choices in 2006, Coles outsourced the workforce in its warehouse to Toll Group, effectively wiping its hands of any responsibility for their pay and conditions. These kinds of deals have been allowed to flourish under Australian workplace laws, and they've played a major role in the spread of insecure work. As the Howe inquiry recommended, this could be fixed through changes to the Fair Work Act to recognise that both the labour provider and the host employer have a responsibility and an obligation to ensure workers' rights and entitlements. Over coming years, unions will be campaigning for all political parties to commit to these and other changes called for in the Howe inquiry. And unions will be making similar demands of employers through enterprise bargaining and through the award-making process. The ACTU's Secure Jobs campaign is an important part of our vision for the Australian economy. It's not just about workers' rights, but the future of our skills base and therefore our productivity. For the past year, a one-sided debate has been taking place about productivity. Actually, it's not really a debate at all. It is just uncritical reporting of self-interested comments from business leaders that do not bear up to scrutiny. Now, it is correct that productivity growth in Australia has slowed since the late 1990s. But what is not spelled out is quite how this diagnosis fits with the business lobby's prescribed cure, which invariably consists of a reduction in workers' rights. Australia has experienced strong productivity growth in the past under an industrial relations system which actually gave workers robust protections. And in the 2000s, the Howard government's anti-worker approach to industrial relations did not in any way revive our sagging productivity growth. It's lazy opportunism to blame the 3-year-old Fair Work Act for Australia's decade-plus slowdown in productivity growth. A substantial proportion of the slowdown, as the Productivity Commissioner and the Treasury have observed, is due to big business investments in resource projects, which use large amounts of capital and labour for several years before they start to generate output. And, as Senior Treasury official David Gruen pointed out recently, poor management has also been to blame. In the long run, the real drivers of productivity and rising living standards are investment in infrastructure, in education, as well as research and development in world-class management. Now, the true debate about productivity should be about how we move to high value-added, high-performance workplaces with job and income security. This must ensure that casual and contract workers get the skills, training they are not getting in an economy that treats them as disposable. It's not acceptable and it's not sustainable to have shortages of skilled labour accompanied by unemployment and underemployment. We must avoid the low road of wage cuts and eroding working conditions. You know, the prolonged slump in the US economy should tell us that Australia's sluggish productivity growth won't be fixed by tearing up our industrial relations laws or eliminating minimum wages and the safety net, or doing away with penalty rates and shift loadings, or removing unfair dismissal protections. The ACTU's Secure Jobs campaign is the start of a new national conversation about how we invest more in our people. Now, there are many people in Australia, and I would say actually the majority, who don't see their values reflected in the rhetoric they're hearing from business groups. They want us to live in a functioning society, not just an efficient economy. These are people who question the privatisation of assets we should be holding in trust for future generations. They question the cuts to our public health and our education systems, who do not accept that our future is longer hours, less security, lower pay and inequality. I believe the role of unions has never been more important. Technological development and therefore workplace change has never been so rapid or on such a large scale, and individual workers have never needed a collective voice more. Unions do have a broader role to play in our society. We're fighting for a society that respects fairness and which does not leave the vulnerable behind. The fights that nurses and teachers are having is not just about paying conditions, they're about preserving our public health and education systems for the future. How can we have a quality healthcare system when nurses are worried about when their next shift will be? How can we have a quality education system when teachers are stressed and anxious about whether or not they'll have a contract next term? The manufacturing unions are fighting not just for their members' jobs, but for an industry on which many small businesses depend, and for a diverse economic base which actually provides strength to our economy and does not become over-reliant on mining. Unions know if there is to be any move towards a more progressive Australia, towards a fairer society, then it must be led by us. Ladies and gentlemen, I am incredibly proud to be the head of a union movement that gives a voice to Australian workers. A union movement which is unafraid to engage on the big issues facing Australia and which recognises that fairness at work cannot be separated from fairness in society. Thank you.